The smoke on Kira's 7 never cleared. 3 days into the engagement, and David Chen had learned this moon's particular flavor of hell, a permanent haze of burning polymers and vaporized metal that turned every breath into a calculated risk. He crouched in what remained of a supply depot, his hands slick with blood that wasn't his own, working on a soldier who kept apologizing for bleeding so much. "Stop talking, save your energy," David said automatically, his fingers locating the shrapnel fragment embedded near the femoral artery. One wrong move and Private Morrison would bleed out in under 2 minutes. "No pressure. This is going to hurt." Morrison screamed when the fragment came free, and David's hands moved through the practice sequence: pressure, clamp, seal, inject. The biofoam expanded in the wound cavity, buying time until real surgery could happen, assuming any of them survived long enough to see a proper medical facility. "You're going to be fine," David told him, already moving to check the next casualty. "Keep pressure on that, don't try to walk." Morrison grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Doc, you gotta get out of here. Command says the Kresh are pushing through Sector 7. This position's gonna be overrun." "Then help will arrive faster," David said with a calm he didn't feel. "They'll need to evacuate wounded anyway." He'd been having this argument for 72 hours. Ever since the Kresh Collective decided that humanity's 3 colony worlds in the Kira's system represented unacceptable territorial expansion. Never mind that humans had been here for 15 years, had built settlements and farms and schools. The Kresh wanted the system, and they had the firepower to take it. Humanity was learning, very quickly, that being new to galactic politics meant being everyone's convenient target. David moved through the makeshift triage area, checking vitals, adjusting IV lines, doing what he could with supplies that should have run out yesterday. 12 casualties in various states of critical, 4 that he'd already tagged as expectant, medical euphemism for going to die, focus on those you can save. He hated that tag, hated the calculus that turned people into resource allocation problems. Sergeant Williams appeared at the depot entrance, her armor scorched and her face grim. "Doc, we're falling back to the secondary line in 20 minutes. Can these people move?" David looked at his patients. Morrison and 3 others could walk with assistance. The rest would need stretchers they didn't have, carried by soldiers they couldn't spare. The expectant tags wouldn't survive transport. "Most of them with help," he said. "Give me 30 minutes to prep them." "I can give you 15. Then people die." Williams's jaw tightened. "People are dying already. Whole damn war is people dying. We stay here much longer, you die too, and then who patches up the next batch?" She wasn't wrong. David had heard variations of this argument before, from instructors and field commanders and his own exhausted brain at 3 in the morning. One medic who survives to treat hundreds versus one medic who dies trying to save a dozen. The math was brutal and clear. He kept working anyway. 15 minutes then, Williams said, something like respect in her voice. "Don't make me drag you out." She left to organize the retreat, and David accelerated his preparations, explaining to those conscious enough to understand that they were moving, that everything would be fine. Lies that medical personnel told because sometimes hope was as important as antibiotics. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the symphony of warfare. Not weapons fire or structural collapse or wounded soldiers, but something closer. Movement in the debris field to his left, in a section that command had declared cleared hours ago. David paused, listening. There it was again, a scraping sound followed by labored breathing. "Stay here," he told Morrison, as if the man could go anywhere with his leg wrapped in biofoam and trauma bandages. "Doc, that's a bad idea," Morrison warned, but David was already moving toward the sound, medkit in hand, because 3 years of field medicine had taught him that his job wasn't waiting for permission to help people. The collapsed structure had been a residential unit before the Kresh bombardment turned it into abstract art rendered in broken concrete and twisted metal. David picked his way through carefully, aware that one wrong step could bring the whole thing down on his head. The breathing was louder now, ragged and pained. Human, he couldn't tell through the rubble. "Hello," he called out. "Can you hear me? I'm a medic. I'm here to help." No response except that labored breathing, getting weaker. David found her wedged under a support beam that had somehow landed at an angle, creating a pocket of space that had probably saved her life. She was covered in dust and blood, her armor cracked like eggshell, and she was definitely not human. The long ears gave it away immediately, elegant points that rose from silver hair matted with blood and debris. Her skin had that faint luminescence he'd seen in training materials about various species. Though covered in dirt and gore, it was hard to identify which one. Her armor was unlike anything he'd encountered, sleek and organic-looking despite being half destroyed. She was also dying. David's brain cataloged injuries with clinical detachment while his hands were already moving, checking pulse points, evaluating breathing, looking for active hemorrhage. Deep laceration along the left side, possible internal bleeding. Burns on her left arm, second degree at least. Head wound, maybe concussive trauma. "Can you hear me?" he asked, knowing she probably couldn't understand him but needing to try. "I'm going to get you out of here. Just stay still." Her eyes flickered open briefly, gold irises with an intensity that made his breath catch, then closed again. She murmured something in a language his translator couldn't parse, then went still. Not dead, David verified by pulse check, but close enough that the distinction barely mattered. He keyed his comm. "Sergeant Williams, I've got a casualty in the residential ruins, grid 772. Alien, species unknown, critical condition. I need assistance with extraction." Static, then Williams's voice, tight with stress. "Doc, we don't have time for." "Grid 772, David repeated. "Send whoever you can spare. I'm not leaving her." More static, probably Williams arguing with herself about whether to court-martial a medic for insubordination. Then 5 minutes, Chen. That's all I can give you. David didn't waste time responding, already working to stabilize his patient enough for transport. The support beam was too heavy to move alone, but he could widen the gap enough to pull her through if he was careful and lucky. He was neither, but he tried anyway. The beam shifted with agonizing slowness, David's muscles screaming protest as he leveraged it with a piece of rebar. Inch by inch, the gap widened, and he could see more of her. The armor was definitely custom work, marked with symbols he didn't recognize, and her weapons, lying beside her, were clearly sophisticated pieces of engineering far beyond standard military issue. A soldier in his position should probably wonder if he was saving a friend or enemy. David just saw another person who needed help. Finally, enough space. He dropped the rebar and moved to extract her, hands gentle despite the urgency, aware that rough handling could turn survivable injuries into fatal ones. She was heavier than she looked, the armor's weight catching him off guard, but he managed to slide her free of the debris. Up close, her face was striking despite the blood and dirt, sharp features that suggested both elegance and deadly purpose, even unconscious. Those ears, which seemed to be the only major visible difference from human, twitched slightly as he lifted her, some autonomic response to movement. Williams arrived with 2 soldiers just as David laid his patient on clearer ground and began emergency treatment in earnest. "Holy shit," one of the soldiers breathed. "Is that Doc? Do you know what you're holding?" "A patient with critical injuries who needs immediate attention," David said, cutting away damaged armor to access the side wound. "Help me or get out of the way." Williams moved closer, and her expression shifted from irritation to something like shock. "Chen, look at the armor design. That's Zarinth." David barely heard her, focused on the arterial bleeding he'd just exposed. "Great, glad we've solved the mystery. Hand me the clotting agent from my kit." "You don't understand," Williams insisted, but she was already digging through his supplies. "The Zarinth Dominion, they're not in this fight. They're observers. What's one of their soldiers doing here?" bleeding out unless we stop talking about politics. David applied the clotting agent, watching the wound respond. Hold pressure here while I check for internal damage. For the next 10 minutes, they worked in tense silence broken only by David's terse instructions and the distant sounds of ongoing battle. The woman remained unconscious throughout, which was probably fortunate given the pain David was definitely causing her even with local anesthetics. When he finally sat back, satisfied he'd done everything possible in field conditions, Williams gave him a look that mixed exasperation with something that might have been respect. She's stable. For now, needs surgery and real medical facilities, but she'll survive transport. David wiped blood from his hands onto his already ruined trousers, same as everyone else. But everyone else isn't Zarinth military, Williams said quietly. Command is going to have questions. They can ask them after she's in recovery. David started prepping her for transport, wrapping her wounds properly and securing the loose armor pieces. Right now, she's just another casualty. One of the soldiers cleared his throat. Doc, with respect, the Zarinth aren't just anything. They're the dominant military power in 4 sectors. Their warriors are legendary. We're supposed to avoid contact with them entirely. Then they should have avoided crashing on a battlefield where I could find them, David said. New rule. If you bleed in my sector, you're my responsibility. Species doesn't matter. Williams actually smiled at that. You're either the bravest medic I've met or the dumbest. Probably both. David finished his preparations and looked up at his patient's face, peaceful in unconsciousness. Help me get her back to the depot with the others. We're out of time. They managed the extraction with minutes to spare before the order came to evacuate. David supervised the transport of all his patients, including his mysterious Zarinth warrior, refusing to leave until everyone was loaded and moving to the secondary position. As they retreated through smoke and chaos, David glanced back at the woman he'd pulled from the rubble. She remained unconscious, her face slack with exhaustion and pain, and he found himself wondering who she was, what circumstances had led to her being alone and injured on this battlefield. He'd probably never know. Once they reached proper medical facilities, she'd be transferred to her own people, and he'd move on to the next crisis, the next set of impossible decisions about who lived and who died. That was the job. Save who you can, don't think too hard about the rest, and definitely don't get attached to patients who would disappear into the chaos of war as quickly as they'd appeared. Good advice. David suspected he wasn't going to follow it. The secondary position turned out to be a partially intact warehouse that smelled like industrial solvents and broken promises. David set up his triage area in the corner, offering the most structural integrity, arranging his reduced casualty list as comfortably as space allowed. The Zarinth woman, he still thought of her that way, lacking a better identifier. He placed slightly apart from the others, not out of prejudice but practical concern that having an unconscious alien warrior in close proximity might spook the already traumatized soldiers. Talk to me about her condition, Lieutenant Ramirez demanded the moment David finished his initial setup. The lieutenant had arrived with the evacuation convoy, taken one look at the Zarinth armor, and developed what David professionally diagnosed as acute political anxiety. Stable but critical, David said, checking the woman's vitals again. Pulse steady, breathing regular, but she'd lost enough blood that infection was a serious risk. Deep laceration nearly reached the peritoneal cavity, second-degree burns on the left arm, possible concussion. She needs surgery within the next 12 hours, or complications become likely. Can she be moved to a Zarinth facility? In theory, yes, if we knew where one was and could guarantee safe transport. David adjusted the IV line he'd rigged from their dwindling supplies. In practice, moving her again before she's properly stabilized is medically inadvisable. Ramirez rubbed his face, looking about as exhausted as David felt. Command is having a collective breakdown about this. The Zarinth have been strictly neutral in the Kira's conflict, Finding one of their soldiers here on our battlefield, injured. It's a diplomatic nightmare waiting to happen. She's not a nightmare, she's a patient, David said, perhaps more sharply than advisable when speaking to a superior officer. Whatever politics are happening above our pay grade, right now she's just someone who needs medical care. That's it. I admire your ability to reduce everything to medical ethics, Doc, but the real world doesn't work that way. Ramirez crouched beside the unconscious woman, studying her face with obvious fascination and nervousness. You know anything about the Tsarinth? Dominant military power, been around for about 3,000 years. Excellent reputation for not starting fights but finishing them decisively. David recited what he remembered from the cultural briefings all human personnel received before deployment. Also notoriously private, rarely interact with younger species, consider displays of weakness to be, what was the phrase? Unforgivable dishonor. Why? Because that armor she's wearing, I had a xenotech specialist look at the images. It's not standard military issue. It's custom, high-ranking, probably officer class. Ramirez straightened up. We're not treating some random soldier, Chen. We've got someone important. David glanced at his patient, seeing her with slightly different eyes. The quality of the armor made more sense now, as did the sophisticated weapons that had been secured in evidence. Someone important, bleeding in his field hospital because he'd happened to hear her breathing under the rubble. Does that change her treatment protocol? He asked. No, but it changes everything else. Ramirez moved toward the exit. I'm posting guards. Not because I think she's a threat while unconscious, but because if she wakes up and decides we're enemies, I want people who can respond. She's injured and weak. She's not going to. The Tsarinth have a documented history of warriors fighting through injuries that would kill most species, Ramirez interrupted. Adrenaline suppressors, pain tolerance training, genetic modifications, they're built different. So yes, she's staying under observation. The lieutenant left before David could argue further, leaving him alone with his patients and the complicated reality that he'd saved someone who might view that rescue as dishonor rather than gratitude. The night cycle on Kira's 7 wasn't much different from the day cycle. Same smoke-filled air, same distant weapons fire, just with artificial lighting instead of the moon's dim sun. David worked through it with mechanical efficiency, checking on patients, adjusting medications, doing the thousand small tasks that kept people alive when proper medical facilities were light years away. Around 300 local time, his Tsarinth patient stirred. David noticed immediately. He'd been monitoring her more closely than strictly necessary, telling himself it was professional diligence while knowing it was also fascination. She didn't wake violently, just a gradual return to consciousness signaled by changing breathing patterns and slight movements. He approached carefully, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. Hey, you're safe. You were injured, I'm a medic. Can you understand me? Her eyes opened, those gold irises that seemed to catch and hold light, and focused on him with startling intensity. For a moment she just stared, processing, evaluating. Then she moved. It was faster than David's brain could register. 1 second she was lying on the cot. The next she had him pinned against the wall with one hand around his throat, her body between him and any potential escape, despite the fresh blood seeping through her bandages from the violent movement. Designation, she demanded, her voice rough but carrying absolute authority. The translator rendered it with only slight lag. Why have you interfered? David couldn't speak with the pressure on his throat, but he kept his hands away from her, showing no resistance. Fighting would be pointless and counterproductive. She must have seen something in his expression, maybe the lack of fear or the obvious concern for her reopened wounds, because the pressure eased slightly. Speak. David Chen, he managed hoarsely. Field medic, human expeditionary force. I found you injured in the rubble. I treated your wounds because that's what I do. You're safe here. She studied his face with an intensity that made him feel dissected, analyzed, Catalogued. Then pain clearly hit her, the adrenaline that had enabled her sudden movement crashing against the reality of her injuries, and she staggered back, releasing him. David resisted the urge to rub his throat, instead gesturing to her bandages. "You've reopened the side wound. Sit down before you make it worse." She looked at him like he'd suggested she grow wings and fly. "You dare give commands." "I dare suggest that bleeding out would be counterproductive," David said, moving cautiously toward his medical supplies. "But you're conscious and mobile, so technically I can't stop you from doing whatever you want. I just prefer you didn't die after I spent with weapons not quite pointed at her, the general atmosphere of controlled chaos that defined every field medical station. Where am I? Kira's 7, secondary defensive position, approximately 15 kilometers from where I found you." David gathered supplies, moving slowly to avoid triggering her defensive reflexes. "The battle's ongoing, but this area is currently secure. You were unconscious for approximately 7 hours. She processed this, her hand moving instinctively to where her weapons should be. Finding them absent, her expression darkened. "You have taken my equipment." "Standard security protocol for unknown combatants," David said apologetically. "I argued against it, but I'm a medic, not command. They're secured and undamaged. You'll get them back once people figure out what's happening politically." "Politically?" She said it like the word tasted wrong. "You treat this as political matter." "I treat this as medical matter. Command treats it as political matter. We agree to disagree." David gestured to the cot. "Seriously, please sit. Your wound is bleeding, and I'd rather not restart the entire treatment process." She stared at him for a long moment, then, to his surprise, complied, lowering herself to the cot with careful control that didn't quite hide her pain. David approached cautiously, his hands visible, and began checking her bandages. "This will hurt," he warned, beginning to remove the soaked dressing. She made no sound as he worked, but he felt her tension, saw the way her jaw tightened. The wound had definitely reopened, not catastrophically but enough to require new sutures. "I need to clean and close this properly," David explained, preparing his materials. "I have local anesthetic, but given your species' unique physiology, I'm not sure how effective it'll be. This is going to be uncomfortable." "Proceed," she said shortly. David worked in focused silence, cleaning the wound with careful thoroughness before beginning the delicate process of suturing. She remained perfectly still throughout, her breathing controlled, giving no indication of pain beyond the occasional muscle tremor his hands detected. "You have done this before," she observed as he worked. "Unfortunately, yes. 3 days of constant casualties tends to build experience quickly." David tied off a suture, moved to the next. "Though you're my first Zarinth patient. If I'm doing anything that contradicts your medical needs, please tell me. You treat me as you would your own species." "I treat you as someone who's injured and needs help. Species doesn't really factor into the medical ethics." He paused in his work to look at her directly. "Is that wrong? Should I be doing something different?" She didn't answer immediately, studying him with that same intense evaluation. "You ask my preference in my own treatment." "Well, yeah. It's your body. You're conscious and capable of consent. I'm not going to just do things to you without explanation." David returned to his suturing. "Medical care works better as a collaboration in my experience." "Collaboration," she repeated like testing a foreign concept. "What is your name again?" "David Chen. You can call me David or Doc, or that annoying human who won't stop asking if you're comfortable." He finished the final suture and began bandaging. "What should I call you?" Another pause, longer this time. "Zara." "Nice to meet you, Zara, though I wish it were under better circumstances." David secured the bandage properly, then sat back to check his work. "There. Try not to do any more sudden violent movements for at least 48 hours. The sutures will hold, but they're not indestructible." Zara looked down at the fresh bandaging, then back at him. "Why did you help me?" "Because you were injured and I'm a medic. That's the whole reason. There isn't a deeper explanation. Your people are in conflict with the Kresh. You have no alliance with the Zarinth, no obligation to provide aid. Yet you expended resources, exposed yourself to danger, to extract me from rubble and treat my wounds. She tilted her head slightly, ears adjusting in what he was learning to read as deep thought. This makes no strategic sense. Medical care isn't about strategy, David said, beginning to clean up his supplies. It's about seeing someone who needs help and providing it. You think I checked your species identification before pulling you out of that collapsed building? I heard someone breathing in the rubble and responded. That's it. That is unusual. Is it? Do Zarinth medics refuse treatment based on species? Zarinth warriors rarely require assistance, she said, something complex in her tone. We are trained to endure, to overcome injury through discipline and will. To accept help is to admit weakness. David absorbed this, understanding clicking into place. So by helping you, I've actually created a problem. You have created a situation without precedent in my experience. Zara looked at him with those gold eyes, and something in her expression suggested vulnerability she probably didn't intend to show. I do not know how to process this. Process it as someone doing their job, David offered. You got hurt, I helped. No honor lost, no weakness admitted, just biology and medicine intersecting. Can we leave it at that? She didn't answer, but something in her posture shifted. Not quite relaxation, but a decrease in defensive tension. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the field hospital continuing around them. Your forces are losing this engagement, Zara said eventually. Yep, David agreed without hesitation. The Kresh have superior numbers, better technology, and apparently no qualms about bombardment of civilian areas. We're holding through sheer stubbornness, but it's not sustainable. Yet you remain here, treating wounded, when retreat would be strategically sound. Someone has to, David shrugged. Besides, I'm not great at strategy. I'm great at stopping bleeding and setting bones, so that's what I do. Zara studied him with that intensity that felt like being scanned by sophisticated sensors. You are either extremely brave or extremely foolish. Definitely the second one, David said. Ask anyone who knows me. That earned what might have been the ghost of a smile, difficult to tell with an alien species, but something in her expression softened infinitesimally. Over the next hours, as other wounded arrived and David worked himself into exhaustion, he noticed Zara watching him. Not threatening, just observing. She refused to stay down despite his medical advice, insisting she was recovered enough to be mobile, though she moved with careful precision that suggested her injuries were still very much present. When a soldier arrived with shrapnel wounds and went into shock, thrashing against David's attempts to treat him, Zara moved without hesitation. She appeared beside the cot, placed one hand on the soldier's shoulder, and spoke in a voice that carried absolute command. In the soldier's own language, David realized with surprise. The soldier calmed immediately, whether from her tone or her obvious warrior bearing, and David was able to complete treatment without further complication. "Thank you," he said when the soldier was stabilized and resting. "He was impeding medical treatment," Zara said. "That is tactically unsound. Still, I appreciate it." David moved to his next patient, aware of her presence nearby like a warm spot in his peripheral vision. She stayed in the medical station for the remainder of that day, neither helping nor hindering, just watching. David caught her observing his interactions with patients, the way he explained procedures, the gentle encouragement he offered those in pain, the dark humor he employed to diffuse fear. As artificial evening settled over Kira's 7 and the day's casualties were finally stabilized, Zara approached him again. "You are exhausted," she stated. "Astute observation," David agreed, allowing himself to slump against the wall. 3 days without real sleep tends to have that effect. Yet you continue working. People continue blading, it's a whole cycle. He looked at her, noting that her color was better, her movements less pained. "You should rest too." Your body needs recovery time regardless of how much your warrior training tells you otherwise. I will be leaving soon, Zara said. My people will have begun search operations. Once I signal my position, extraction will be swift. David felt something unexpected, disappointment maybe, or regret that this strange interlude was ending. Probably for the best. You need proper medical facilities, and your presence here is causing command all sorts of political anxiety. Before I go, Zara paused, seeming to struggle with words. You asked nothing of me. No information, no leverage, no favor in return for your aid. This is not behavior I have encountered before. Should I have asked for something? In my experience, all beings act from self-interest. Even apparent altruism serves some purpose. David considered this. Maybe my self-interest is just living in a universe where people help each other when they can. Where someone being injured is reason enough to intervene, regardless of politics or species or strategic calculation. That's the universe I want, so I act like it already exists. Maybe if enough people do that, eventually it will. Zara stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the warehouse exit. David watched her go, feeling the absence of her presence like a physical thing, and wondered if he'd ever know why a Zaranth warrior had been alone on that battlefield, or what circumstances had led to their brief intersection. Probably not. That was war, brief connections severed by circumstance, people who mattered intensely for a moment, then disappeared into the chaos. He returned to his patience, pushing Zara out of his mind with practiced discipline, and tried not to think about those gold eyes that had looked at him like he was something unexpected and possibly dangerous. Just another patient. Nothing more. The offensive came at dawn on day 4, and it came with the kind of overwhelming force that made David understand why the Creche had conquered 17 systems in the past decade. The bombardment was so intense that the warehouse's partial integrity became complete lack of integrity, and David found himself organizing an evacuation, while enemy fire rained down with mechanical precision. Everyone who can walk, move to the transport vehicles now. He shouted over the cacophony, already helping those who couldn't. Morrison, the soldier he'd treated on day 1, was trying to carry another wounded man despite his own injuries, and David wanted to scream at the stubborn heroism and also weep with pride at it. The next 6 hours were a blur of motion and terror. They retreated through burning streets, David and 3 other medics coordinating a running triage operation that defied every principle of safe medical practice. Casualties mounted faster than he could process them, the numbers transitioning from tragedy to statistics to white noise. By early afternoon, they'd reached what command optimistically called the final defensive position, a hastily fortified zone that everyone understood was less defensive position and more place where we'll make our last stand. David set up in an abandoned storefront that still had 3 walls and most of a roof, which made it practically luxurious by current standards. The wounded kept coming, and he kept working, his hands moving through procedures by muscle memory while his conscious mind retreated somewhere safer. He didn't notice the pattern at first. He was too focused on the immediate crisis of 30 critical patients and supplies sufficient for maybe 12. But soldiers started reporting something odd. Creche assault units approaching the medical station were being intercepted before reaching their target, not by human forces, which were stretched impossibly thin, but by something else. Someone else. Single combatant, Lieutenant Ramirez reported during a brief lull, his voice tight with confusion. Moving through enemy positions like they're not even there, eliminating threats with precision I've never seen. No identification, no communication, just appearing when Creche get close to your position then vanishing. David, elbow deep in someone's chest cavity trying to repair a punctured lung, barely registered this. Great, we have a guardian angel. Can they donate blood? Because I'm out and people are dying. But as the day progressed and the pattern continued, David found himself wondering. The Creche had superior tactics, overwhelming numbers, and momentum. The fact that this medical station hadn't been overrun defied logic. Then the impossible happened. It started with every military communication device simultaneously broadcasting an incoming transmission on priority override. Command frequencies, tactical channels, even civilian emergency bands, all hijacked by a signal that identified itself with a sigil David didn't recognize, but every military officer apparently did, based on their collective expressions of shock and terror. This is Empress Zarakith of the Zarinth Dominion, Supreme Commander of the Imperial Fleet. The voice was unmistakable. He'd heard it much quieter, rough with pain, asking him why he'd interfered. Now it carried absolute authority across every frequency. We are establishing presence in the Kira's system. All Creche forces are ordered to withdraw immediately to the outer markers. Failure to comply will be met with decisive response. David's hands stilled in the wound he was treating, his brain struggling to process the words. Empress. Zarakith. The woman he'd pulled from rubble, whose wounds he'd dressed while she lay unconscious and vulnerable in his field hospital. That Zara. Holy shit, someone whispered, probably expressing what everyone was thinking. The transmission continued. Human defensive forces maintain current positions. Zarinth vessels are entering orbit now. You have 30 minutes to prepare for full Creche retreat from your location. 30 minutes later, exactly as promised, the assault stopped. Creche forces pulled back with the kind of speed that suggested panic, and the sky above Kira's 7 filled with ships bearing markings David had seen only in briefing materials. The Zarinth Imperial Fleet, arriving with the force that had dominated this sector of space for millennia. Lieutenant Ramirez appeared in the medical station, his face pale. Command is going insane. The Zarinth have never directly intervened in a conflict like this. Never. And now they're here, driving the Creche out of human territory, and no one knows why. David was applying pressure to a bleeder, trying to keep one more person alive, but his mind was elsewhere. Zara, the injured warrior he'd treated with the same care he'd show anyone. The woman who'd watched him work with that intense observation, who'd helped calm his patient, who'd left without explanation. Empress, Supreme Commander, the most powerful military leader in known space. He'd bandaged her wounds and told her to rest. There's a communication request, Ramirez said, his voice strange. For you specifically, Chen, from the flagship. David looked up sharply. Me. Yeah. The Empress of the Zarinth Dominion wants to speak with field medic David Chen. Immediately. The world tilted slightly. David looked at his patient, at his blood-covered hands, at the impossible situation unfolding around him. I'm kind of busy with the not letting people die thing. Chen, the most powerful being in 4 sectors, is requesting your presence. You don't say I'm busy. Watch me. David returned to his work. Tell her I'll be available once my patients are stabilized. She can wait. Ramirez made a sound like a dying animal. You want me to tell the Empress to wait? I want you to tell her that I'm doing my job, same as when I treated her, and she'll understand. David met the lieutenant's eyes. Trust me on this. Whether Ramirez did trust him, or just decided that telling an Empress to wait was someone else's problem, he left. David worked for another 2 hours, stabilizing the critical cases and ensuring everyone who could be saved was receiving proper care. Only then did he allow himself to be escorted to the communication center that had been hastily established in what used to be a school. The view screen activated, and there she was. Zara looked nothing like the injured warrior he'd treated. She wore ceremonial armor that seemed to be part metal and part liquid light, her silver hair arranged in elaborate styles he couldn't begin to parse. She was surrounded by advisors and what were clearly high-ranking military officers, all maintaining careful distance that spoke of absolute respect and possibly fear. But those eyes, those gold eyes fixed on him with the same intensity he remembered. David Chen, she said, and hearing his name in that voice made something in his chest do complicated gymnastics. "Your Majesty," David managed, because his 3 weeks of diplomatic protocol training suddenly seemed woefully insufficient. "Nice to see you recovered." Several of the surrounding Zarinth made shocked sounds. One did not speak casually to the Empress. David, who had seen her bleeding and vulnerable, apparently missed that memo. Zara's lips curved very slightly. "Your concern for proper protocol remains charmingly absent. This is appreciated, as we have much to discuss." "About why you're here driving the Kresh out of human territory?" David asked. "Because I'll be honest, I'm as confused as everyone else." "We are here because of you," Zara stated, and the words hung in the air like a detonated bomb. "I'm sorry, what?" "You treated our wounds without knowing our identity. You showed care and respect that had nothing to do with power or position. You demonstrated principles your species claims to value but rarely practices: compassion without expectation of reward, assistance without calculation of benefit." She paused, and something in her expression shifted. "We have spent 4 days observing this battlefield, watching you work, watching you exhaust yourself saving others, watching you treat the lowest-ranked soldier with the same dedication you showed us." David's brain was having trouble keeping up. "You've been here, on the battlefield." "We could not leave while you remained in danger," Zara said simply. "We are capable of extended combat despite injury. Our wounds, while serious, were not sufficient to prevent us from ensuring your safety." "The mysterious guardian angel protecting the medical station," David breathed, understanding crystallizing. "That was you." "We do not tolerate threats to those who have earned our respect," Zara said. "And you, David Chen, who dressed our wounds and asked nothing in return, who treated us as a person rather than an empress, you earned that respect." One of her advisors leaned in, whispering something urgent. Zara listened, then responded in her own language with a tone that suggested the conversation was over. "Our council is concerned about this decision," she told David. "They believe personal sentiment should not influence strategic policy. They are incorrect. The Zarinth Dominion is formally intervening in this conflict, driving the Kresh from human territory because humanity produced you. A being who embodies principles we claim to honor but often forget. If your species can create such individuals, they deserve opportunity to thrive." "That's," David searched for words, "that's not rational policy. I'm just one person, a not particularly special person who happens to be good at treating injuries. You are a person who saw the most powerful warrior in the galaxy, bleeding in rubble, and responded with gentleness." Zara's voice was quiet but carried across the communication. "Do you understand what that means? For 117 years we have been Empress. We have commanded fleets, conquered enemies, ruled billions. In all that time, no one has looked at us without fear or calculation. Until you." David felt something tighten in his throat. "I was just doing my job. You were demonstrating what your species could be. What any species should strive to be." She leaned forward slightly. "We are announcing formal intervention now. The Kresh will withdraw or face Zarinth military response. Your human forces will be supported until this conflict reaches resolution. But understand this, we are doing this because of you personally. You created an honor debt we intend to repay." "I don't want anything," David protested. "You don't owe me." "We owe you everything," Zara interrupted. "You gave us something we had forgotten existed, the experience of being treated as a being worthy of care rather than as a weapon to be deployed. Such debts cannot be measured in standard terms." One of the advisors spoke up, his translated voice tight with concern. "Your Majesty, with respect, the Council requires." "The Council will accept our decision," Zara said without looking away from David. "We have spoken." She stood, and the whole command deck behind her responded, everyone snapping to attention with the precision of absolute discipline. "David Chen, you will be pleased to know that we are assigning protective detail to your position. You will not be endangered further in this conflict." even if he still had no idea how to bill for the medical supplies. The war ended within a week, the creche withdrawing from human territory with the kind of speed that suggested they had no interest in testing whether Zarinth threats were genuine. David spent that week in a newly established field hospital that actually had walls and supplies and medical staff who weren't operating on adrenaline and spite. It should have been a relief. It was a relief. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something unfinished hung in the air. A conversation interrupted before reaching its conclusion. He saw evidence of Zarinth presence everywhere. Their ships maintained orbital positions. Their forces coordinated with human military to establish secure zones. Their medical supplies arrived with the kind of abundance that made David want to weep with joy and frustration over what he could have done with these resources earlier. But he didn't see her. Zara remained aboard her flagship, conducting whatever diplomatic and military operations Empresses conducted when reshaping regional power structures. David heard reports. She was negotiating formal alliance terms with human leadership, establishing military cooperation protocols, arranging technology exchanges that would accelerate human development by decades. All because he'd pulled her from rubble and treated her wounds. The absurdity never quite faded. On the 8th day, as he was checking on Morrison's recovery, the soldier was doing well, already joking about having the most expensive battlefield injury in human history. David's comm chimed with a message marked priority. Field Medic David Chen, your presence is requested aboard the Imperial flagship Eternal Radiance for private conference with Empress Zarakith. Transport is waiting. David stared at the message, his heart doing complicated gymnastics. Morrison, if I don't come back, tell everyone I was a delight to work with. Doc, you're meeting the Empress, not facing execution. With my luck, those might be the same thing. The transport was a Zarinth military vessel that made human shuttles look like children's toys. All smooth lines and technology David couldn't begin to identify. The pilot, a Zarinth warrior with the kind of bearing that suggested she could kill everyone in the shuttle without breaking a sweat, maintained professional silence during the brief flight to the flagship. The Eternal Radiance was massive, a vessel designed for commanding fleets and projecting power across star systems. David was escorted through corridors that seemed to shift and adjust around him, following his guide to a private chamber that looked nothing like the command deck he'd seen on the viewscreen. It was smaller, quieter, with walls showing the same amber glow he remembered from his brief glimpse of Zara's quarters before. Personal space, not official venue. Zara stood by a viewport showing Kira's 7 below, still wearing formal armor but with a relaxation in her posture that suggested she was off-duty, as much as an Empress could be. David Chen, she said without turning, thank you for coming. Like I was going to say no to an imperial summons. David moved to stand beside her at the viewport, maintaining respectful distance. How are your wounds? Any complications from the sutures? She turned to look at him, and something in her expression suggested amusement. You have been granted audience with the supreme military commander of the Zarinth Dominion, and your first question concerns suture complications. I'm a medic, it's kind of my thing. David met her eyes, so any pain, inflammation, reduced range of motion. The wounds healed well. Your treatment was excellent despite primitive resources. Zara's tone softened. Though we have been informed by our medical staff that the suturing technique you employed is not standard for humans. You adapted your approach to accommodate physiology you had no formal training in. I improvised based on what seemed logical. If I did something wrong, you did everything correctly. That is what intrigues us. She gestured to seats that grew from the floor, that same organic technology David had seen in the field. Sit, we wish to speak with you properly, without the performance required by public communication. David sat, acutely aware that he was still in field uniform that had seen better days, probably smelled like antiseptic and blood, and was absolutely not dressed for private meetings with galactic rulers. Zara settled across from him with that fluid grace, and for a moment they just looked at each other, the Empress and the medic, connected by circumstances neither had planned. "You have questions," she stated. "Ask them." "Why were you alone on that battlefield?" David said immediately. "The official reports say you were conducting reconnaissance, but that doesn't explain why the Supreme Commander of the Imperial Fleet was personally on the ground during an engagement she had no stake in." Zara's ears tilted in what he was learning to recognize as approval. Perceptive. We were observing the conflict to determine whether human forces warranted consideration for potential alliance. The Kresh have been problematic for years, but intervention requires justification. We needed to understand what humanity truly represented. And you decided that required being personally present. "We have ruled for 117 years from command decks and throne rooms. We had forgotten what war looks like from the ground, where decisions become reality in blood and fear." She looked at her hands. The reconnaissance was meant to remedy that ignorance. Instead, it reminded us why we became commander in the first place, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. What happened? The Kresh ambush. We were careless. Allowed sentiment to compromise tactical awareness. The ambush should not have succeeded, but we were. She paused, searching for words. Distracted by what we observed. Human forces fighting with inadequate resources against superior enemy. Losing but refusing to accept defeat. It was compelling. David processed this. "So you got so interested watching us lose that you didn't notice enemies approaching?" "Essentially, yes. It is embarrassing." "That's very human of you," David said, then caught himself. "Sorry, I don't mean that as an insult. We take it as compliment." Zara smiled slightly. "You survived the crash then." "Barely. Eliminated the immediate threats, but sustained injuries that compromised combat effectiveness. We were attempting to reach Zarinth extraction point when the structure collapsed. We would have eventually extricated ourselves, but you found us first. And I ruined your warrior reputation by treating you like a regular injured person." "You saved our life," Zara corrected quietly. "That is not ruination, that is grace." The word hung between them, weighted with meaning David wasn't sure he fully grasped. "We have been warrior since childhood," Zara continued. "Trained in combat, strategy, command. Taught that strength is absolute, that weakness is failure, that asking for help is surrender. For 117 years, we have embodied these principles. We have never been defeated, never shown vulnerability, never allowed anyone to see us as anything other than the perfect weapon our people required." She looked at him directly. "Then you pulled us from rubble while we were unconscious and helpless. You treated our wounds with gentleness we have never experienced. You asked our preference in our own treatment, as if our opinion mattered beyond tactical assessment. And when we woke and attempted to assert dominance, you responded not with fear but with concern for our reopened sutures." David remembered that moment, her hand around his throat, the absolute certainty that she could kill him without effort, and his primary concern being that she was bleeding. "It seemed like the most pressing issue at the time," he said, "because you saw us as person, not as threat or asset or political entity, just as being who was injured and needed care." Zara's voice dropped lower. "Do you understand how revolutionary that is? How unprecedented? I treated you the same way I treat everyone. That's not revolutionary, it's just baseline decent behavior. But it is revolutionary when no one has done it in over a century." She stood, moving back to the viewport. "After we recovered, we could not leave. Our duty demanded we return to the fleet, that we resume command, that we treat the incident as closed matter. But something prevented us." "You stayed on the battlefield," David said, understanding dawning. "You were the one protecting the medical station. We could not allow harm to come to the human who showed us kindness, without calculation." Zara kept her back to him. "We told ourselves it was honor debt, tactical observation, intelligence gathering, all lies. The truth is simpler, we wanted to understand you." This being who treated the most powerful warrior in the galaxy as if power was irrelevant, who valued life over strategy, who embodied principles we thought existed only in philosophical texts. "But I'm not that special," David protested. "Any medic would have done the same." "We observed other human medics," Zara interrupted. "They make choices. Some prioritize by rank, others by survival probability, others by emotional attachment. All understandable. But you treated everyone as if they all equally deserved to live. You exhausted yourself trying to save people your own command had designated as unsavable. You argued with superior officers to protect patients who had no strategic value. You demonstrated absolute commitment to principles at cost to yourself." She turned back to face him. "That is not common behavior, David Chen. Not among humans, not among Zarinth, not among any species we have encountered. You are exceptional, whether you acknowledge it or not." David felt heat rising in his face. "I was just doing my job." "Your job does not require you to spend 3 hours saving one soldier when that time could save 3 others. Your job does not require you to refuse evacuation until every patient is transported. Your job does not require you to treat enemy wounded with the same care as your own forces." Zara moved closer. "But you did all these things. We watched you do them." "But you were supposed to be recovering." "We recovered while observing," she said. "Zarinth physiology is resilient. The wounds you treated healed rapidly once immediate danger passed. But we chose to remain because we needed to understand if what we saw in you was anomaly or indicator of human potential." David stood as well, feeling the need to be on equal footing. "And what did you conclude?" "That humanity is worth protecting, worth allying with, worth investing in." Zara's gold eyes held his. "Not because of tactical advantage or strategic benefit, but because species that produces individuals like you deserves opportunity to show what it can become." "That's a terrible basis for galactic policy," David said weakly. "It is the only basis that matters." She took another step closer, and David became acutely aware of her presence. The height difference, the way her armor caught light, the intensity of her focus that made him feel simultaneously exposed and valued. "We are announcing formal alliance between Zarinth Dominion and human settlements. Technology exchange, military cooperation, cultural sharing. Our council protests, but we have overridden their concerns." "Because I treated your wounds. Because you reminded us what honor truly means." Zara reached out, and David felt her hand touch his shoulder, light contact but carrying weight. "We are assigning permanent protection detail to your position. You will not be endangered in future conflicts." "I'm a field medic. Danger is part of the job description." "Then we will ensure the job description changes." Her hand remained on his shoulder. "David Chen, you saved our life. More than that, you showed us possibility we had forgotten existed. That beings can choose compassion over calculation. That strength can include gentleness. That helping others without expectation of reward is not weakness, but the highest form of courage. I really just bandaged you and told you not to move too much. You treated the Empress of the Zarinth Dominion like a regular person who deserved care and respect." Zara's voice was soft but absolute. "No one has done that in our lifetime. Perhaps no one has ever done that. And we find we do not wish to return to a universe where such treatment remains impossible." David felt something shift in the space between them, something that transcended politics or species or the vast differences in their positions and power. "What are you saying?" he asked quietly. "We are saying you changed us," Zara said simply. "In 4 days of observation, you demonstrated more true strength than we have seen in a century of warfare. You make us want to be worthy of the regard you show every being you encounter. That is not effect we expected from field medic who pulled us from rubble." "So what happens now?" "Now we build alliance. We support human development. We work to create galaxy where compassion is valued as highly as combat prowess." She paused, and we make excuse to maintain contact with the human who dressed our wounds and asked nothing in return. David's heart was doing complicated things in his chest. You want to maintain contact with me specifically? We do. Zara's hand dropped from his shoulder, and he felt the loss of contact like cold air. If you are willing. We understand you have duties, patience, a life that does not include entertaining the demands of galactic rulers who have become inconveniently attached to their former medic. Inconveniently attached, David repeated. Is that the official Zarinth term? It is our personal term, she said. Official terminology would take hours to explain and bore us both. David laughed, surprising himself with the sound. You saved my entire species from being overrun by the creche, and now you're asking if I'm willing to maintain contact. That seems like I should be asking you. You treated our wounds without knowing who we were. You owe us nothing. Then I guess we're both choosing this without obligation. David met her eyes directly. Yes, I'm willing to maintain contact, though I should warn you I'm terrible at formal communication. You'll get field reports full of medical jargon and probably inappropriate humor. We have spent 117 years receiving formal reports that say nothing of value. Your version sounds preferable. They stood there in the amber-lit chamber while Kira's 7 turned below them, and David felt the strangeness and rightness of the moment in equal measure. The Empress who had been vulnerable in his field hospital, who had watched him work for days, who had decided that humanity deserved protection because one medic had treated her with kindness. It was insane. It was unprecedented. It was, David thought, exactly the kind of universe he'd been trying to build through every small act of care. I should probably get back, he said eventually. I have patients who need follow-up, and Morrison will assume I was executed if I don't return soon. Of course. Zara moved toward the chamber exit and David followed, but at the doorway she paused. David Chen, one final question. Yeah. When you found us in the rubble, why did you not hesitate? You could have called for backup, waited for assessment of the situation, but you immediately began extraction and treatment. Why? David thought about it, trying to put into words something he'd never fully articulated even to himself. Because someone was hurt, he said finally, and if I'd waited, they might have died. Everything else, species, politics, danger, all that was just noise. The only thing that mattered was someone needing help, so I helped. Zara looked at him with those ancient gold eyes, and David saw something there that might have been wonder or recognition, or something he had no name for. That, she said quietly, is why you are exceptional, and why the galaxy is fortunate you exist within it. She stepped closer, and before David could process what was happening, she touched her forehead to his. A gesture he didn't understand but felt the significance of in every nerve. Then she stepped back, formal bearing returning. Transport will return you to your station, but know this, you have earned the respect and protection of the Zarinth Dominion. For as long as we rule, you will be valued and safe. And after you're done ruling, we have no plans to stop, she said with something that might have been amusement. Longevity treatments are very effective. David returned to Kira's 7 with his head spinning, and his heart doing strange rhythms. Morrison took one look at him and started laughing. Doc, you look like you've been hit by a transport. I think I've been hit by something weirder, David admitted. Possibly by the entire concept of galactic politics. He returned to work, checking on patients and filing reports, and doing all the mundane tasks that kept people alive in the aftermath of conflict. But his comm held a new contact now, a direct line to the Empress of the Zarinth Dominion, who had asked if she could maintain contact with the medic who'd treated her wounds. The universe